I stared at the computer screen and felt my hands shake. In 12 years as a geneticist, I thought I had seen everything. Every mutation, every genetic twist that life could throw at someone. I was wrong. The results on my screen that Tuesday afternoon at 2:30 challenged everything I believed about DNA, about fate, about the stories our bodies tell us before we're even born. My name is Michael O'Sullivan, and I work at one of Boston's leading hospitals. My days were predictable. Samples arrived, I ran tests, I delivered results. Good news, bad news, or somewhere in between. I thought I had grown immune to surprises, until David Castellano walked into my office. He was 42, tall, with thick black hair, and the kind of strong handshake that made you trust him immediately. But behind his brown eyes, I could see something that made my chest tighten. Fear. Raw. Consuming fear. "Doctor, I need to know," he said, sitting across from my desk. His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed against his knee. "I need to know if I'm going to end up like my father, like my brothers." I had read his file before our meeting. The Castellano family carried a shadow that had haunted them for generations. A rare genetic mutation that seemed to choose its victims without mercy. Robert Castellano, David's father, had been 38 when his body began to betray him. Strong one day, fighting for his life the next. Anthony, the eldest brother, made it to 41. Vincent, the younger one, barely reached 35. All three men had carried the same genetic signature. All three had lost their battle. "I wake up every morning checking myself," David continued, rolling up his sleeves unconsciously. "Every headache, every moment of fatigue, every time I feel different. I wonder if today is the day it starts." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. "My daughter just turned 16. She's looking at colleges, talking about her future, and all I can think about is whether I'll be there to see her graduate." I had handled cases like this before. Families trapped by their genetics, living under the weight of what might come. But something about David was different. Maybe it was the way he spoke about his daughter, or the quiet resignation in his voice, as if he had already accepted his fate. "The tests will take about a week to process," I explained. "We'll look for the specific mutation that affected your family members." He nodded slowly. "And if it's there," I chose my words carefully, "then we'll discuss what that means for you." What I didn't tell him was what I already suspected. Based on his family history, the chances were overwhelming. This mutation didn't skip generations. It didn't play favorites. After David left my office that day, I couldn't shake the image of his face. There was something about him that reminded me why I became a geneticist in the first place. Not for the science, not for the research, but for the people sitting across from my desk, waiting to learn what their future might hold. I had entered genetics believing that knowledge was power, that understanding our genetic makeup could help us prepare, help us fight, help us live better lives. But after 12 years, I had learned that sometimes knowledge felt more like a burden. The Castellano mutation was particularly cruel. It affected the body's ability to produce a crucial protein, leading to progressive weakness and organ failure. There were no treatments that could stop it, no medications that could reverse it. I had delivered this kind of news before. I had watched families crumble under the weight of genetic certainty. I had seen people give up on dreams, on plans, on hope itself. But I had also seen something else. I had seen people find strength they never knew they had. I had watched families grow closer in the face of uncertainty. I had witnessed moments that reminded me that we are more than the sum of our genetic parts. As I waited for David's results that week, I found myself thinking about fate, about whether our genetics truly determine our path, or whether there's something more at play. I thought about David's daughter, about the colleges she was researching, about the future she was planning. I thought about David himself, how he carried himself with dignity despite the fear that consumed him. The laboratory called me on Friday afternoon. David's samples were ready for analysis. I pulled up the data on my computer, expecting to see what I had seen so many times before. The telltale markers that would confirm what we both already suspected. But as I scrolled through the genetic sequence, something caught my attention. Something that made me lean closer to the screen, my heart beginning to race. I ran the analysis again, thinking I had made an error. Then a third time. The results were the same each time. but they made no sense. They challenged everything I thought I knew about genetics, about this particular mutation, about what was possible. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. None of us were prepared for what those results would reveal. The mutation was there, clear as daylight, written in David's genetic code like a signature he never asked for. The same deadly sequence that had claimed his father, his brothers, every male in his family line. I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar weight in my stomach. The weight of being the messenger, the one who had to look someone in the eye and change their world forever. But then I saw something else. Something that made me blink hard and lean closer to my monitor. Right there, woven into David's DNA like a protective shield, was something I had never seen before. His body had created what looked like a genetic workaround, a natural bypass that seemed to neutralize the deadly mutation completely. I rubbed my eyes, thinking the long hours were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. In 12 years of genetic analysis, I had never encountered anything like this. The mutation was present, but somehow David's cells had found a way to ignore it entirely. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call Dr. Sarah Chen, my colleague who had been working in genetics even longer than I had. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. "Sarah, I need you to look at something," I said when she picked up. "Can you come to my office?" Now. 20 minutes later, she was standing behind my chair, studying the same results that had left me speechless. "This is David Castellanos' analysis," I explained. "The family I told you about. 3 generations of the same mutation, all fatal." Sarah adjusted her glasses, scrolling through the data with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading genetic codes. "The mutation is definitely there," she said quietly. "But this—" She paused, pointing to a section of the screen. "Michael, what am I looking at here?" "That's exactly what I was hoping you could tell me." We spent the next 2 hours going through every possible explanation: equipment malfunction, sample contamination, human error. But every test we ran came back with the same impossible result. David Castellano carried the mutation that had taken every male in his family. But his body had somehow created a genetic shield against it, a natural protection that shouldn't have existed. "Have you told him yet?" Sarah asked as we sat in the growing darkness of my office, the only light coming from the computer screen. I shook my head. "I called him yesterday and told him the results were in, but I needed more time to review them. He's coming in tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Michael, in 25 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything like this. The science says this shouldn't be possible. But it is possible. It's right there in front of us." She nodded slowly. "The question is, what do you tell him? How do you explain something that has no explanation?" I had been asking myself the same question all day. How do you tell someone that they've been living in fear of a genetic sentence that their own body had already commuted? How do you explain that sometimes, in the most extraordinary circumstances, life finds a way to rewrite its own rules? That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about David, about the years he had spent waking up each morning wondering if his body would betray him, about his 16-year-old daughter, about the college brochures she was collecting, about the future he thought he might not see. I thought about his father Robert, about Anthony and Vincent, about how they had faced their fate with whatever courage they could muster. And now David, who carried the same genetic burden but somehow, impossibly, had been given a different story. The next morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. I arrived at the hospital early, reviewing David's results one more time, still hoping to find some logical explanation for what I was seeing. At exactly 10 o'clock, Jennifer Murphy from the front desk called to tell me David had arrived. I walked to the waiting room and saw him sitting alone, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and I saw in his eyes the same fear I had seen a week ago, only deeper now. The fear of someone who was about to learn his fate. "Mr. Castellano," I said, extending my hand. "Thank you for coming in." He stood up, his handshake firm despite the tension I could feel radiating from his entire body. "Dr. O'Sullivan," he said, I've been preparing myself all week for what you're going to tell me. As we walked back to my office, I wondered how you prepare someone for news that defies preparation entirely. But what happened next would stay with me forever. David sat down in the same chair where he had been a week ago, but everything about him was different. His shoulders were tense, his breathing shallow. He had the look of a man who had spent 7 days preparing for the worst news of his life. "I brought this," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I wrote a letter to my daughter. You know, in case—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I looked at that piece of paper, thinking about all the conversations it might contain, all the things a father would want to say to his child if he knew his time was limited. "David," I began, then stopped. "How do you start a conversation that's going to change everything someone believes about their future?" I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times since yesterday. Different ways to explain what I had found, different approaches to help him understand something that even I couldn't fully comprehend. But sitting there, looking at this man who had carried the weight of genetic certainty for his entire adult life, all my prepared words disappeared. "The results are complex," I said finally. "I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it's unlike anything I've encountered in my career." David nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. I turned my computer screen toward him, showing him the genetic analysis that had kept me awake for 2 nights. "This is your genetic sequence," I explained, pointing to the data. "And this section here, this is the mutation that affected your father and your brothers." I watched his face change as the reality settled in. His worst fears were being confirmed right in front of his eyes. "It's there," he said quietly. "Just like I knew it would be." "Yes," I said. "The mutation is definitely present in your DNA." David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a resignation there that broke my heart. "How long do I have?" he asked. "That's where this gets complicated, David. That's where everything we thought we knew about genetics gets turned upside down." I moved the cursor to another section of his genetic code, the part that had made Dr. Chen and me question everything we understood about hereditary conditions. "This is what I've never seen before," I continued. "Right here, your body has created what we can only describe as a natural protection against the mutation." David stared at the screen, confusion replacing the resignation in his eyes. "I don't understand," he said. "Neither do we, completely. But what appears to have happened is that your DNA has developed a way to neutralize the harmful effects of the mutation. It's as if your genetic code wrote its own defense system." The silence in my office was complete. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the hospital, but inside this room, time seemed to have stopped. "Are you telling me—" David started, then paused. "Are you saying I'm not going to get sick?" I chose my words as carefully as I had ever chosen anything in my professional life. "I'm saying that based on these results, the mutation that affected your family members appears to have no impact on your health. Your body has found a way to make it irrelevant." David stared at me for a long moment, as if he was waiting for me to tell him this was all a mistake, that I had mixed up his results with someone else's. "But that's impossible," he whispered. "My father, my brothers, they all had the same thing. They all had the mutation, yes. But they didn't have what you have. This genetic protection, this natural bypass, it's unique to you." I watched as David tried to process information that challenged everything he had believed about his future, his family, his own body. "I've spent 15 years waiting to get sick," he said, his voice barely audible. 15 years checking myself every morning, wondering when it would start. 15 years afraid to make long-term plans. He looked down at the letter in his hands, the words he had written to his daughter in case he wouldn't be there to say them in person. "I turned down a promotion last year," he continued. "I didn't want to take on more responsibility if I wasn't going to be around to see it through." The weight of what he was telling me settled over the room like a heavy blanket. All the decisions he had made, all the opportunities he had passed up, all the ways he had shaped his life around the expectation of an early ending. "David," I said gently, "I need you to understand something. This doesn't mean you're invincible. This doesn't mean you'll never face health challenges. What it means is that the specific genetic condition that affected your family doesn't appear to be a threat to you. He nodded slowly, but I could see he was still struggling to absorb what I was telling him. How is this possible? He asked. How can I have the same mutation but not be affected by it? Honestly, we don't fully understand the mechanism. Genetics is still a field where we're learning new things every day. What I can tell you is that your body has done something remarkable, something we rarely see in genetic medicine. Doctor. Chen had spent hours with me the day before, reviewing similar cases in medical literature. We found a handful of documented instances where individuals had carried harmful mutations but remained unaffected, but nothing quite like David's situation. Sometimes, I continued, the human body surprises us. Sometimes it finds solutions that science hasn't discovered yet. David was quiet for several minutes, staring at the genetic analysis on my screen. I could almost see his mind working, trying to reconcile 15 years of fear with this new reality. My daughter, he said suddenly. What about Emma? Could she have inherited this protection, or could she have inherited the original mutation? It was a question I had anticipated, and one that would require its own testing and analysis. We can certainly test Emma when she's ready, I explained. But based on what we're seeing with your genetics, there's reason to be hopeful about her situation as well. David looked at the letter in his hands again, then carefully folded it and put it back in his pocket. I wrote her about being brave, he said. About facing challenges with courage. About not giving up even when things seem impossible. He paused, a small smile appearing on his face for the first time since he had walked into my office. I guess I never imagined I'd be the one learning those lessons from my own DNA. As I watched David begin to absorb the magnitude of what his test results meant, I realized I was witnessing something that went beyond medicine, beyond science, beyond anything I had learned in my training. I was watching a man discover that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, life rewrites the rules in our favor. And I had no idea that the most powerful part of this story was still to come. David sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, his eyes moving between the genetic analysis on my screen and the letter in his pocket. I could see years of fear and resignation slowly giving way to something else. Something I rarely witnessed in my office. Hope. Dr. O'Sullivan, he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I nodded, preparing myself for whatever question was coming. Is there any chance you're wrong? Is there any possibility that this protection you're seeing might not work? That I could still develop the condition later? It was the question I had been dreading, because it forced me to confront the limits of what we actually knew about David's situation. I can't give you absolute certainty, I said carefully. Medicine rarely deals in absolutes. What I can tell you is that everything we're seeing suggests that your body has found a way to neutralize this particular genetic threat. David absorbed this answer, and I watched something shift in his expression. Instead of the fear I had expected, I saw determination. You know what that means? He said, leaning forward in his chair. That means I've been living my life based on a maybe. I've been making decisions based on something that might never happen. He pulled out his phone and stared at it for a moment. I need to call my daughter, he said. I need to tell her that her father is going to be at her high school graduation, and her college graduation, and maybe even her wedding someday. The emotion in his voice was raw and immediate. This was a man who had spent 15 years planning for an abbreviated life, and now he was being handed back a future he thought he had lost. There's more I need to tell you, David, I said, about what this discovery might mean beyond just your own health. He looked up from his phone, curious. Your genetic protection, this natural bypass your body created, it's not just remarkable for you. It could potentially help us understand how to protect other people who carry similar mutations. I had spent hours discussing this with Dr. Chen and other colleagues. David's case represented more than just a personal medical miracle. It was a window into possibilities we had never considered. Are you saying that what's happening in my body could help other families like mine? David asked. Potentially, yes. We'd need to study your genetics much more thoroughly, and we'd need your permission to share your case with researchers who specialize in genetic protection mechanisms. But David, You might be carrying the key to helping people who are facing the same fears you've lived with. The magnitude of this possibility seemed to hit David all at once. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. My father used to tell me that everything happens for a reason, he said quietly. I stopped believing that when I watched him get sick. I stopped believing it when Anthony started showing symptoms, when Vincent began to weaken. He turned back to face me. But what if he was right? What if I was supposed to carry this mutation not to suffer from it, but to help find a way to protect others? I had seen many reactions to genetic test results over the years, but I had never seen someone transform their personal medical information into a mission to help others so quickly and completely. David, that kind of research takes time, years potentially, and there are no guarantees about what we might discover or how it could be applied. I understand, he said, returning to his chair. But for the first time in 15 years, I'm thinking about what I can give to the future, instead of what the future might take from me. He paused, looking down at his hands. I have a confession to make, he continued. Last month, Emma asked me to walk her down the aisle at her wedding someday. She was joking around, planning her imaginary future wedding like 16-year-old girls do. His voice caught slightly. And I told her we'd talk about it when she got older. I couldn't promise her something I didn't think I'd be alive to do. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of all the promises David had been afraid to make. All the commitments he had avoided. All the dreams he had pushed aside. She's been asking me about college visits, he went on. She wants to look at schools in California, in Seattle, places far from home. And I kept suggesting schools closer to Boston, telling her it would be better for the family if she stayed nearby. I realized I was witnessing more than just the delivery of medical results. I was watching a man confront 15 years of decisions made from a place of fear, and beginning to understand how different those decisions might have been if he had known what we knew now. The promotion I mentioned, David said. It was a position that would have required extensive travel, working with international clients. I told them I needed to stay close to home for family reasons. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The truth is, I was afraid to take on something big when I thought I might not be around to finish it. I was afraid to disappoint people, to leave projects unfinished, to let teams down. I watched David begin to catalog the ways fear had shaped his choices, and I saw something I rarely see in my profession. I saw someone getting the chance to reconsider their entire approach to life based on new information. But that's not the hardest part, he continued, his voice growing quieter. The hardest part is thinking about all the conversations I didn't have with Emma. All the times I held back from really connecting with her because I was terrified of making my eventual absence even more painful for her. This was the moment when David's transformation became complete. I could see it in his posture, in the way he held his head, in the clarity that had replaced the fear in his eyes. I've been protecting her from losing me, he said. But what I've actually been doing is protecting myself from the pain of loving her completely. He stood up again, but this time with purpose rather than restlessness. Dr. O'Sullivan, I want to participate in any research that might help other families. I want Emma to know about this genetic protection, so she can make her own informed decisions about testing. And I want to go home and tell my daughter that her father is planning to be around for a very long time. As I watched David prepare to leave my office, I realized that what I had witnessed wasn't just the delivery of unexpected medical results. I had watched fear transform into hope, resignation become determination, and a life defined by limitations suddenly expand into possibilities. There's one more thing, David said as he reached the door. That letter I brought today, the one I wrote to Emma in case the news was bad. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and looked at it one more time. I'm still going to give it to her, he said. Not because I'm worried about running out of time, but because I realize I've already wasted too much time not telling her how much she means to me. He paused at the doorway. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we think we'll have tomorrow. As David walked out of my office that day, I sat back in my chair and stared at the genetic analysis that had started this entire journey. I thought about the mystery of DNA, about the ways our bodies can surprise us, about the difference between what science predicts and what actually happens in the unpredictable laboratory of human life. But mostly, I thought about the power of hope to transform not just how we see our future, but how we understand our past and what we choose to do with our present. And I knew that this case would change not just David's life, but my entire understanding of what genetic counseling could accomplish when science reveals something truly extraordinary. 3 weeks later, David came back to my office. But this time, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a young woman with the same dark hair and determined eyes. Emma Castellano was 16, but she carried herself with a maturity that reminded me instantly of her father. "Dr. O'Sullivan," David said, his voice filled with a warmth I had never heard before. "I'd like you to meet my daughter Emma. She has some questions about genetics, and I thought you might be the best person to answer them." As Emma settled into the chair where her father had sat just weeks earlier, I could see the intelligence and curiosity that David had described. But I could also see something else: the weight of growing up in a family haunted by genetic uncertainty. "My dad told me about his test results," Emma began, her voice clear and confident. "He explained that he has the mutation, but that his body found a way to protect itself from it." She paused, looking directly at me. "I need to know if I might have inherited that same protection, or if I'm carrying the original mutation without any defense." I had anticipated this conversation from the moment David first learned about his genetic protection. Family genetics rarely affects just one person, and Emma had every right to understand her own genetic inheritance. "Those are exactly the right questions to ask," I told her, "and we can definitely explore those answers through testing, when you're ready." "I'm ready now," Emma said without hesitation. "I've spent my whole life watching my dad worry about getting sick like my grandfather and my uncles. I've seen how that fear shaped our family, how it affected the way he planned for the future." David reached over and took his daughter's hand. The gesture was small, but I could see the connection between them had deepened in ways that went far beyond genetics. "The night after Dad got his results," Emma continued, "he came to my room and we talked for hours. Really talked, for the first time in years. He told me about all the things he had been afraid to plan for, all the conversations he had been avoiding." She looked at her father with a mixture of love and gentle reproach. "He told me he had been holding back from really being my dad, because he was scared of making it harder for me when he got sick. But what he didn't realize is that his fear was already making things harder." I watched David's face as his daughter spoke, and I saw the complex emotions of a parent who had been trying to protect his child, but had ended up creating a different kind of pain. "I want to get tested," Emma said, turning back to me. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I want to make decisions about my life based on real information instead of fear or assumptions." Over the following weeks, we ran Emma's genetic analysis. David waited with the same intensity he had shown for his own results, but this time the waiting was mixed with hope rather than consumed by dread. When Emma's results came in, they told a story that was both similar to and different from her father's. Emma had inherited the mutation, but she had also inherited something else: the same genetic protection mechanism that had saved her father's life. The day I delivered Emma's results, I watched a family that had been shaped by genetic fear transform into a family empowered by genetic knowledge. "So I have the mutation, but I also have Dad's protection," Emma said, studying her own genetic analysis with the same intensity her father had shown. "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "Your DNA appears to have the same natural bypass mechanism that neutralizes the harmful effects of the mutation." David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what this meant. "2 generations," he said softly. "2 generations of protection that we never knew existed." But Emma was already thinking beyond her own results. "What about future generations?" she asked. "If I have children someday, what are the chances they would inherit this protection?" It was a question that pushed us into even more complex genetic territory, but it was also a question that demonstrated how this family had moved from fearing the future to actively planning for it. "That would depend on many factors," I explained. "But the fact that this protection appears to be inherited suggests it could potentially be passed on to your children as well." As we discussed the implications of Emma's results, I realized I was witnessing something remarkable. A family legacy that had been defined by genetic tragedy was being rewritten as a story of genetic resilience. But the impact of David's case extended far beyond his own family. Dr. Chen and I had begun collaborating with genetic researchers at 3 other medical centers, sharing David's case data with scientists who specialized in genetic protection mechanisms. The response from the research community was immediate and intense. "Michael," Dr. Chen told me one afternoon as we reviewed the latest research proposals, "David's genetic profile is being called one of the most significant discoveries in hereditary disease protection in the past decade." We had received requests from researchers in Boston, New York, San Francisco, and even international institutions. Everyone wanted to understand how David's body had developed this natural protection, and whether similar mechanisms could be found in other patients. "The potential implications are staggering," she continued. "If we can understand how David's genetics created this protective mechanism, we might be able to develop treatments for other people who carry similar mutations." David had enthusiastically agreed to participate in expanded genetic studies, providing additional blood samples and detailed family history information that could help researchers understand how this protection had developed. But perhaps more importantly, David had become an advocate for genetic testing and research in ways I had never expected. He started speaking to families affected by hereditary diseases, sharing his story, and encouraging others to pursue genetic testing, even when they were afraid of the results. "I spent 15 years living in fear of something that wasn't actually threatening me," he would tell them. "But I never would have known that without getting tested." His message was powerful because it came from someone who had lived the fear these families were experiencing, but had discovered that sometimes testing reveals hope rather than despair. 3 months after David's initial results, I received a call that demonstrated just how far-reaching the impact of his case had become. "Dr. O'Sullivan, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the Genetic Counseling Program at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. I have a patient here whose family history is remarkably similar to the Castellano case you published in the Journal of Genetic Medicine. She was calling about a 28-year-old woman whose father and brother had been affected by the same rare mutation that had claimed David's family members. Based on your research with David Castellano, we ran expanded genetic analysis looking for protective mechanisms," Dr. Martinez continued. "And we found something incredible. This patient also carried the mutation, but she also had developed her own version of genetic protection, different from David's but equally effective. Dr. O'Sullivan, I think we're looking at the beginning of understanding a whole new category of genetic adaptation. Your patient may have opened the door to discoveries that could help hundreds of families." As I hung up the phone that day, I realized that David's story had evolved from a personal medical mystery into something much larger. It had become a catalyst for research that could potentially transform how we understand and treat genetic diseases. But the most powerful impact remained personal. 6 months after his initial appointment, David brought Emma back to my office for a follow-up visit. But this time, they were accompanied by someone else. "Dr. O'Sullivan," David said with a smile I had never seen before, "I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Maria Santos." Maria was a warm, intelligent woman who worked as a high school counselor. As David introduced her, I could see the joy and confidence that had replaced the fear and resignation I had witnessed in our first meeting. David told me he had been avoiding serious relationships because he was afraid of putting someone through what his mother experienced with his father, Maria explained. But after his test results, he realized he had been making decisions based on possibilities rather than realities. Emma grinned at her future stepmother. I told Dad that he needed to stop being scared of living his life and start actually living it. As I watched this family that had been rebuilt on a foundation of hope rather than fear, I understood that genetic counseling at its best wasn't just about delivering test results. It was about helping people understand how genetic information could empower them to make choices that aligned with their actual circumstances rather than their fears. David's case had taught me that sometimes the most important discoveries in genetics aren't about predicting disease, but about revealing the remarkable ways human bodies can protect themselves in ways science is still learning to understand. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't certainty about their future, but the freedom to embrace that future without the weight of unfounded fear. But there was still one more surprise waiting in David's remarkable story. 1 year after David's initial test results, I received a phone call that would complete his story in a way I never could have anticipated. "Dr. O'Sullivan, this is David Castellano. I'm calling because something extraordinary has happened, and I thought you should be the first to know." His voice carried an excitement I had never heard before. mixed with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "I'm at the hospital right now," he continued, "but not as a patient. I'm here because Maria is in labor. We're having a baby." The news hit me like a physical impact. David, who had spent 15 years afraid to plan beyond the next medical appointment, was about to become a father again at 43. "A baby," I repeated, still processing what he was telling me. "I know what you're thinking," David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed this was possible either. But when you discover that your future is completely different from what you thought it would be, everything becomes possible." 3 hours later, David called back. "Dr. O'Sullivan, I'd like you to meet James Robert Castellano. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and absolutely perfect." James Robert, named after David's father and brother, but destined for a completely different story. 2 weeks later, David brought his new family to my office. Maria cradled baby James while Emma, now 17 and preparing for her senior year of high school, beamed with pride at her new baby brother. "I wanted James to meet the doctor who gave our family back its future," David said, as he settled James into his arms. Looking at this scene, I was struck by the complete transformation I was witnessing. A year earlier, David had sat in my office prepared to receive what he thought would be a genetic sentence. Now he was holding a son he never thought he would have, planning a future he never thought he would see. "There's something else I need to tell you," David said. "Something that completes this story in a way that still gives me chills." He looked down at James, then back at me. "We decided to have James tested as well. Not because we were worried, but because we wanted to understand his genetic inheritance right from the beginning. I had anticipated this decision. With David and Emma both carrying the mutation and its protective mechanism, James's genetic profile would be crucial information for his future health planning. His results came back yesterday, David. James doesn't have the mutation at all. The significance of this hit me immediately. James had inherited neither the harmful mutation nor the protective mechanism, because he didn't need the protection. "He's completely free of it," David said, his voice filled with wonder. "The genetic shadow that haunted 4 generations of Castellano men ends with him." Maria looked up from the baby blanket she was adjusting. "It's like the family genetic story reset itself," she said softly. "James gets to start completely fresh." As I absorbed the full picture of what had happened to the Castellano family, I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented in my career. A genetic legacy that had claimed multiple lives had not only been neutralized in David and Emma, but had been completely eliminated in the newest generation. "Dr. O'Sullivan," Emma said, speaking up from where she sat near the window. "I've been thinking a lot about what this all means." At 17, Emma had grown into a remarkably thoughtful young woman who understood the magnitude of her family's genetic journey in ways that many adults never could. "I'm going to major in genetics in college," she announced. "I want to study genetic protection mechanisms like the ones Dad and I have. I want to help other families who are living with the kind of fear we lived with." David's eyes filled with tears as his daughter spoke. "A year ago, I was afraid Emma might not have a future. Now she's planning to dedicate her future to helping others." The conversation continued for over an hour, but it was Emma's next statement that would stay with me forever. "The night after I got my test results," she said, "I realized something important. Our family's genetic story wasn't a tragedy that got interrupted. It was always supposed to end this way." She paused, looking at her baby brother sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. Grandpa Robert, Uncle Anthony, and Uncle Vincent, they weren't just victims of a genetic condition. They were part of a story that led to Dad developing this protection, and to me inheriting it, and to James being born completely free of it. The depth of her perspective amazed me. This teenager had found a way to transform her family's history of genetic loss into a narrative of genetic triumph. "Sometimes I think they're the real heroes of this story," Emma continued. "They carried the burden so that we could eventually be free of it." David was openly crying now, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. "Emma helped me understand something," he said. "I spent so many years angry at genetics, angry at the mutation that took my father and brothers, but that anger was misplaced. The mutation wasn't the villain in our story. It was just part of a bigger picture that we couldn't see yet." As David's family prepared to leave that day, he handed me something that surprised me. It was a letter, similar to the one he had brought to his first appointment, but completely different in content. "This is a letter I'm writing to James," he explained. "Not because I'm afraid I won't be around to tell him these things in person, but because I want him to understand someday how genetics gave our family the greatest gift imaginable." I opened the letter and read the first few lines. "Dear James, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that you were born into a family that was transformed by genetic discovery. You'll learn that your grandfather and uncles carried a genetic burden that seemed impossible to overcome. You'll learn that your father and sister inherited protection that science is still trying to understand. And you'll learn that you were born completely free of both the burden and the need for protection." The letter continued for several pages, but what struck me most was its tone. This wasn't a letter written by someone trying to explain tragedy. This was a letter written by someone who had discovered that their family's genetic story was actually a story of triumph disguised as loss. 6 months later, I received an invitation that brought David's story full circle. Emma Castellano was graduating as valedictorian of her high school class, and David wanted me to attend her graduation speech. "She's going to talk about genetics and family legacy," he told me over the phone. "And she specifically asked me to invite you, because she says you're part of our family's genetic story now." The graduation ceremony was held on a beautiful June evening. Emma stood at the podium in her cap and gown, addressing several hundred classmates, families, and faculty members. "I want to talk to you tonight about the power of rewriting your story," she began. "Many of you know that my family has dealt with genetic challenges that affected multiple generations. What you might not know is that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning." She went on to describe her father's journey from genetic fear to genetic hope, her own decision to be tested, and her plans to study genetics in college. "I learned that we have more control over our stories than we think," she continued. "We can choose to be defined by our fears, or we can choose to be empowered by our knowledge. We can let genetics limit our dreams, or we can let genetics expand our understanding of what's possible." As Emma concluded her speech, she said something that encapsulated everything I had learned from the Castellano family's journey. "The most important genetic trait any of us can inherit isn't written in our DNA. It's the courage to face uncertainty with hope instead of fear, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the most unexpected discoveries lead to the most beautiful outcomes." The audience rose in applause, but I was thinking about the broader implications of what I had witnessed over the past year and a half. David's case had led to research breakthroughs that were helping other families around the world. Emma's determination to study genetics would likely contribute to future discoveries that could benefit countless people. Baby James would grow up in a world where genetic protection mechanisms were better understood because of his family's contribution to science. But beyond the scientific impact, this family had taught me something fundamental about the practice of genetic counseling. The most important part of my job wasn't delivering test results or explaining genetic probabilities. It was helping people understand that genetic information, no matter how surprising or challenging, could be transformed into a foundation for hope rather than a source of despair. As I drove home from Emma's graduation that night, I reflected on how this case had changed not just the Castellano family, but my entire approach to genetics. I had learned that the human body is capable of genetic miracles that science is still discovering. I had learned that families can transform legacy of genetic fear into a legacy of genetic resilience. And I had learned that sometimes the most powerful genetic inheritance we can pass on to our children isn't written in our DNA at all. It's the understanding that no matter what our genetics reveal about us, we always have the power to choose what we do with that information. David Castellano walked into my office carrying the weight of genetic certainty. He walked out carrying the gift of genetic possibility. And in the process, he taught me that the most unforgettable stories in genetics aren't about what our DNA predicts will happen to us. They're about what happens when we discover that our bodies, our families, and our futures are capable of writing stories more beautiful than anything we dared to imagine. Have you ever seen life break every prediction and rewrite its own rules? I have. And it changed everything I thought I knew about the power of hope to transform not just our understanding of genetics, but our understanding of what it means to be human.